All right, we are back to begin the real work of the course, starting with a lecture's worth of material on the basic biology of hope and belief that we will pursue from several points of view that are enumerated for you on this slide. We'll start out with some conversation about the evolution of hope, or hope as a matter of evolution as viewed by particular scientists, among whom are some fairly well-known evolutionary biologists. We'll also appeal to some more normal people, not people who profess to be scientists, but people who have thoughts about hope, simply from real life. Secondly, we'll take up the issue of what it means to be biological in nature. Thirdly, we'll look at some examples of hope in cultural icons that are quite diverse in nature in an attempt to demonstrate to you that hope is universal. It's found everywhere. If you open your eyes and put your mind to work, you'll find hope in the most interesting of places and across broad swaths of time and geography. Lastly, in this presentation, we will look at what it means to be scientific, because this is, after all, what we call a science course. Now, a couple of caveats. In future presentations, in addition to this one, I'm going to be dividing the material up into discrete parts. One of the reasons for this is that if you want to download the presentations and you're waiting for your material to appear on your iPhone, let's say, it works better if you have smaller pieces to download, or you won't have to wait so much time for the iPhone to get its act together and bring the material to you. So what will happen is I will pause dramatically at the end of the various parts, if I remember to do it, let's hope, and the person who breaks these up into pieces will use those as places to divide the material up. I'm told that you can watch the entire 45 hours worth of material in one chunk if you want to do it that way, but having these internal divisions allows us to bring it to you in smaller bits that might be easier for you to deal with electronically. Secondly, I record these lectures at my home, which is a farm in Delaware County, and I just want to make you aware of this because from time to time you'll hear the braying of donkeys and mules outside. You will hear the rooster crowing. It's not true that they only crow at dawn. They crow pretty much whenever they feel like it. And in the house with me, I have 6 dogs who will bark from time to time. Not to mention various children who come and go and slam the doors and so forth. So you'll hear some background noise. I'll try to keep it to a minimum, and if it gets terrible, I'll stop the presentation and re-record it. But I'm hoping you are willing to put up with a little bit of inconvenience just to make this stuff available to you in a timely fashion. So with that, let's get started. On part 1, we're going to talk about some ideas about hope as an evolutionary phenomenon. And we'll introduce several different perspectives to back this up. But we're going to begin with those comments of Dr. Lionel Tiger, whose book I mentioned to you in the introduction last time. The correct title of the book is Optimism, the Biology of Hope, which you'll see in a minute is a bit of a misnomer. But because it is ultimately the source of this entire course, it seems logical to give the forum to him. Dr. Tiger is a renowned professor. He is the Darwin Professor of Anthropology at Rutgers, and he's been at this for 50 years. When I was an undergraduate student at the University of Illinois, I became aware of one of his papers in a history of biology class. So he goes back probably to the 70s, if not the 60s, in terms of his scientific publications. He's been around for a long time and has quite a bit of credibility in the scientific community. So here is one of the excerpts from Tiger's book that I found to be particularly useful, and that is his attempt to define the difference between hope and optimism. Often we conflate the two, but according to Tiger, and I think you'll probably agree that hope and optimism, while related, are different things. So here's what Tiger has to say about that. Quote, optimism is the superficial view that everything is going to work out fine because it has to. That's not true. And in fact, it is a dangerous illusion. Hope, on the other hand, is the confidence that there is ultimate meaning even in loss, and that everything works to the good in the fullness of time, even if it is only given to us to know defeat and suffering in our place and time. People can live without optimism. Indeed, I suspect most people in the world do. People cannot live without hope. Unquote. So, this begs the question, why is hope so important to humans and perhaps to other animals as well? Well, here are a couple of reasons that Tiger brought up and others have added as well. One reason is that humans crave a certain level of consistency. We need to have some sort of confidence that we can get through it, even when we are faced with uncertainty. So hope gives us this ballast, this ability to roll with the punches, recover, and continue. Secondly, and this is a theme that we will revisit time and again throughout the rest of this course, human children face a very long period, compared to other animals, of absolute dependence on a caregiver. Usually a mother, could be a father, could be members of the tribe to which you belong. But the point is that humans, as children, are completely unable to take care of themselves and therefore require the intervention of a caring adult in order to do this. Thirdly, as far as we know, and we might want to, not make a pronouncement that is absolute, but as far as we know, we are the only species capable of contemplating our own mortality. Truly, other animals are afraid of death, but they don't know that it is inevitable and that someday all living things will die. And this then begets a certain amount of existential angst in the human brain that from time to time is difficult to deal with. And because of these contrasting needs and contrasting aspects of hope, one of the things that we'll learn about it is that hope itself can be, while at once necessary, also a dangerous thing, which is actually a line from the movie The Shawshank Redemption. So there's this contrarian aspect to hope, if you like to look at it that way. I've in the past called it sort of a schizophrenic nature of hope. It's a yin and a yang both. It's polar opposites knit together. However you want to look at it, take your pick. But we see the contrarian notion or the aspect of hope as we look at what people have to say about it. Truly, yes, hope helps us find meaning in despair and nobility in getting up to fight again the next day. So in that way, it's our source of being able to endure defeat and then plowing ahead, getting back up on that horse, even after you've fallen off, and taking another ride. Without hope, we might just be mired in our own sadness and our own inability to function in the world, and that would be truly a devastating thing. So hope consoles us when we've fallen. In fact, it can bind entire groups together in the exercise of that consolation, and therefore is a thing that helps knit society together. It also gives us a reason to celebrate. It exalts in our triumphs, and that too binds people together. But, as Nietzsche, the philosopher, pointed out, quote, hope is the worst of evils because it prolongs the torment of men, unquote. What did he mean by that? Well, he meant that hope does exactly what I just said. It causes us to get up and try again, even in the face of insurmountable odds. We just keep doing it again and again, irrespective of the probability of success. And to that extent, yes, hope has the capacity to prolong our torment by making us want to try again and again, even against odds that are likely to mitigate against success. So finally, from another cultural icon, The Matrix Reloaded, comes the line, hope. It is the quintessential human delusion, simultaneously the source of your greatest strength and your greatest weakness. So we have these contrasting natures of hope, which we will also see again and again. So, let's talk about hope and biology. Okay, let's take a look at hope as a biological phenomenon. We know or suspect that there is a biological underpinning for this thing called hope. We also suspect that hope itself is intimately related to religion. So the two vehicles that we're using to understand human beings in this course, namely the need for hope and the propensity to believe in a supernatural deity, those two things are joined because both of them have, or we suspect have, a biological basis. So at this point, we need to ask, all right, what exactly do we mean when we say something is biological? Well, in this extent, human behaviors, such as hope or belief in God, human behaviors are similar to human physical characteristics, which you're likely to be more familiar with. So if we think about human physical characteristics, we might talk about eye color, or height, or the shape of your nose, or the length of your arms, or the curve of your ear. Any of those things would have a genetic underpinning and consequently a biological basis. So what we really mean when we say hope is a biological phenomenon is that there is a genetic basis for that behavior, for that trait, and furthermore that it is heritable, that you will pass the genes for that trait on to your offspring. We know from our analysis of physical characteristics like the ones I just mentioned that often those physical characteristics are determined by a single gene, which makes them comparatively easy to study. You have one gene, one trait, that's all you need to worry about. But in the case of a complicated behavior like hope or belief in God, we believe, there's that belief thing again, that these behaviors are due to many genes acting in concert. So we can't trace the behavior to a single gene, although we'll find out later in the course that somebody has tried to do that, but was remarkably unsuccessful because behaviors are almost always the result of many genes and gene products working together to create that trait. I would add at this point that while we're going to be talking about genes a lot and the effects they have and the evolution of those traits through time, we also, in biology, have given up on the idea of genetic determinism 30, 40, 50 years ago when we were first discovering the nature of genes and the DNA that creates those genes. We had this sort of naive and somewhat pernicious idea that your genes very precisely determine the outcome of you. And so if you had a particular genetic makeup, you were, by definition, destined to a particular state. And this is called genetic determination. determinism, the idea that your genes absolutely determine how you turn out as a human being. But we now recognize that that is not true, that you can literally overcome your genes or the prescription that your genes make for you. And that is in a variety of ways. One is through environmental influences. Another is through learning, if the trait is amenable to experience and the learning that takes place from that experience. So your fate is not written specifically and solely in your genes. There are other things that determine how you turn out, or what your phenotype is, to be a little bit more precise. We also know that if a trait is genetic, that the trait can be altered through the force of evolution. And so this gets us into a discussion of Charles Darwin and his legacy in terms of establishing the legitimacy of natural selection as the motive force behind evolution. There are a lot of things we could say about that, and we will say more as the course goes on. But for the moment, let's just review the 4 basic steps that Darwin identified in his theory of evolution by means of natural selection. So first, Darwin noted that for a given trait, whether it's the length of your nose, the color of your hair, the shape of your fingers, whatever, for a given trait, there is variation in that trait within a living population. What did he mean? Well, if you were in a live classroom, you could look around the classroom and you would see, just focusing on eye color, that some people had brown eyes. In fact, most people have brown eyes. Some people have blue eyes. A few people have green eyes. Some really rare people might have gray eyes. At any rate, this difference in eye color is an example of variation within a trait. And what we're saying in this course, that the same holds for genetic behaviors like hope. Secondly, Darwin said that in a population of living organisms, more offspring are produced than can survive. So you can think of this like a game of musical chair. You are in a room, there are a bunch of chairs, but there's one fewer chair than there is people. The music starts to play, and when it stops, you're supposed to find your chair. And so one person is going to be stuck standing after all the shuffling gets done. And that's kind of how natural selection works, because there's not enough resources to support all of the organisms, all the offspring that are produced. Some of the offspring are going to make it, and some will perish. Now, in determining which organisms will perish, truly, some of it is a matter of luck. But more often, those organisms that have favorable variation, go back to point 1 where we talked about variation for a particular trait, those organisms that have favorable variation are more likely to make it in the game of life, and therefore their genes will be passed on when they reproduce. And this means that over time, through this selection process, the selection process is really the game of musical chairs that we identified in point 2, or the fact that there are going to be more organisms produced than can actually survive. So something has to determine which ones make it, and it's the quality and quantity of their favored traits. And as this process, this winnowing process guided by natural selection, plays out over time, the frequency of genes, particularly for those that are favored, will change over time, because as the organisms with favorable variation are preserved, the gene frequencies for those traits will increase in the population over time because they leave more offspring in their wake. And over the long term of this process going on for hundreds of thousands, if not millions of years, we can have long-term diversions in the trajectory of a particular population that can lead to the production of different species, which Darwin kind of summarized under the phrase descent with modification. So that which is true for physical traits is also true for behavioral traits that have a genetic underpinning. They too are heritable, although because we've already said that these behavioral traits are largely determined by multiple genes. We're talking about groups of genes being affected by natural selection in this case. So we could be talking about single or multiple genes, but almost inevitably in the case of behavior, it will be multiple genes. These too can be affected by the environment, or their expression can be affected by the environment. So again, we don't believe in genetic determinism in the case of behavioral traits either. And there's another distinction we like to make in the case of behavioral traits, and that is the differentiation between innate or instinctual traits and those that are learned. What are some examples of instinctive behavior? Here we appeal largely to animals. For instance, when baby ducks are hatched, without any learning or prodding or other kinds of teaching, those babies will immediately follow their mother duck. And scientists, being the disruptive, crazy people that they are, have done weird experiments. For instance, they would get things, objects, inanimate objects that sort of approximate the shape of a mother duck and see if the baby ducks would follow it. And indeed, they would. You can, for instance, take the mother duck away and put a vacuum cleaner in the room, and if it moves, the baby ducks will follow the vacuum cleaner, because that similarity between the vacuum cleaner and the mother duck is enough to release the instinctive behavior of baby ducks to follow their mothers. Another great example of instinctive behavior is that at birth, humans, and I'm sure almost all mammals do this as well, will immediately start rooting around with their little faces looking for a breast upon which to suckle. And this is obviously a very valuable trait, because you want that baby to start eating ASAP. And if that baby cannot eat, it will not survive. So this rooting behavior is of great survival value, and humans are excellent at doing this. So if you are ever in the room when a brand new infant is presented to his mother, you will see that baby go for it. It will start looking for a breast right away. Another fairly common genetic behavior is that of Labrador retrievers. You know that if you have a Labrador retriever and you throw a stick, that dog will go out and chase down that stick and bring it back. And in reality, what we have done as a species that likes these dogs is to simply take an ingrained behavior and accentuate it. Obviously, there probably isn't a real survival value attached to having the dog bring a stick to a human, but there are probably other reasons why retrieving something might be valuable to survival, and we humans have taken that basic trait and extended it to bringing back sticks to people, because we think it's fun to do. And in the case of Labrador retrievers, they might also be trained to bring back dead birds that the owner has shot. But it's basically a natural behavior that we have simply accentuated through training and also through breeding. And lastly, those of you who are horse people know that when frightened, the reaction of a horse, generally, unless cornered, is to not stand its ground, but to take off, get the hell out of Dodge as quickly as possible. And that's one reason why I like donkeys and mules better than horses, because donkeys and mules are pretty much the opposite. They're analytical. They're not going to do anything that will lead to greater danger to themselves, and so they don't take off as their first and one repertoire of skills, unlike horses, who they have very small brains, actually, for the size of their body, and this is their one skill, and they do it relentlessly. So if you ride horses, you have to be prepared for a blue piece of plastic throwing that horse into a paroxysm of craziness and taking off with you. All right, so those instinctive behaviors are genetically encoded, and they're distinct from other kinds of behaviors because they don't require learning. They're present at birth. They can be modified by experience. For instance, the horse example that I just mentioned can be trained largely through desensitization, not to immediately take off when he feels afraid. But the genetic underpinning is instinctive. It's there. That's how they react. And you really have to work hard to get them to overcome that, because there's obvious survival value attached to those behavioral traits. Now, other human behaviors are likewise believed to have a genetic underpinning or genetic component. Furthermore, it's likely that these human behaviors, of which we will speak in detail, are the product of multiple genes acting in concert. But here's the thing that I want to particularly hammer home at this point. When specific behaviors, whether we're talking about hope or belief or any other human behavior that you would like to talk about, when we find these behaviors universally among all human cultures, or at least the ones that we know about, that factor alone, the fact that they're found universally, is reason to adduce that they are genetically programmed. The universality alone is enough to compel us to think that these are genetically determined traits that are heritable. And this is true both in ancient and modern societies. We note that any given trait, let's take religion as an example. If you are a religious person, you probably believe in a particular religion that has a specific set of tenets and rites that you practice. Well, those tenets and rites are not themselves biological. The biological part is the desire to believe in a supernatural deity. However, the specifics of the theology are derived from teaching and learning, so they're environmentally derived. But we still think that the behavior, the desire to believe in hope or in God, is genetic in nature, although modified by our capacity to learn. And a good analogy is that of language. The capacity for language is genetic, but the particular language that we speak is determined by our learning environment and our youthful experiences. So Tiger argues in the book that he wrote that the human capacity for hope is genetic, and therefore it obeys the law of natural selection. Hope ended up in mankind universally because it provided a significant adaptive advantage during the time that mankind was evolving, and as a result, humans who had hope left more offspring than humans who did not have hope. And more recently, Tiger has taken the biology of religion under his wing, and he has written a book in which he argues that religion, too, is genetically encoded in humans. So, one question you might want to ask at this point is, all right, well, we're going to be talking about behaviors, we're going to be treating them as if they were genetic, but how can we study this, and how can we understand how this evolved if it requires looking at ancient peoples who are no longer available to be studied? So what kinds of evidence, because this is a science course, will we be considering in making these arguments? Well, obviously you can start by taking this course, a decision which you apparently have already made, so kudos to you. Other ways we can determine the relationship between our genetics and our behaviors is to look at brain scans. You'll see in a couple of lectures the use of brain scans, such as MRIs, to determine which part of the brain is most active under particular conditions, and this allows us to make a deduction about human behavior from what's going on in the brain scans. Another way we make these connections is by looking at human brain injuries. When you have an injury to the brain and a particular behavior stops, you have evidence that that part of the brain that was injured is responsible in some way for that behavior. The Human Genome Project that came to fruition, about 15 years ago, has been enormously consequential in helping us identify specific genes and their functions. So as time goes on, we'll have more of that information, and we'll be able to parse out, even for complicated traits, I'm pretty sure, these specific genes that are involved in producing that trait. We have all sorts of anthropological studies from which we learn about the universality of human traits. So that part of the argument, I think, is fairly secure. When we say something is universal, we actually have pretty good evidence from many, many different cultures distributed around the globe and across time to back that up. So in modern cultures where we have evidence that's forthcoming in the current time, we can compare that to what we know about ancient societies, either because they have written texts or because they've left artifacts from which we can deduce elements of their behaviors. And those are the kinds of evidence that we'll be looking at in this course. Okay, part 3. I'm sorry, but I've misnumbered these parts. I forgot to number the first part 1, and I started in, never mind, they're misnumbered, but hopefully you'll be able to figure that out as you go along, because the titles of the different parts are the same as the headings on the first slide. I apologize for that. All right. What we want to do now is consider whether or not we see significant evidence of this thing called hope infused throughout human culture. If it's universal, we ought to be able to take any age, any culture in the world and find evidence of hope in it. Because we all speak English, we're going to concentrate on Western culture, but the same is certainly in evidence in other cultures and other times. So I make the argument here that the evidence of hope in our culture is literally everywhere, starting with the foundational documents that we use to establish Western culture. For instance, if we go to Western civilization and specifically focus on ancient Greece, from which our own culture began, we can only go to the Theogony that Hesiod wrote, in which he traced the decline of mankind. It was sort of a downward spiral that was precipitated by a woman named Pandora. She was the first woman. And the reason Pandora, you may know her story already, but I'll recount it in a minute. Pandora released evils because it was a punishment coming from Zeus to punish Prometheus for doing some things that helped humans, and that made Zeus pretty angry. So what happened particularly? What did Prometheus do that angered Zeus so much? Well, there were two things that he did which had the effect of helping mortals. First, Prometheus tricked Zeus into reserving the edible parts of animal sacrifice, which all good Greeks were supposed to do to honor the gods and curry their favor. And this deprived the gods of having those animal parts for their pleasure, which is odd because mostly they just drank ambrosia and stuff. But, Zeus was always looking for a good reason to get mad, and this was one of them. The second thing that Prometheus did was he stole fire from heaven and gave it to man. And this was a really serious violation of the code, because now humans were less dependent upon the gods. They could cook. They could forge their own tools. They could create weapons from iron. They didn't have the need to supplicate themselves to the gods the way they did before, and were able to now dominate nature all on their own. So Zeus got pretty riled about all of this, and he made it pretty clear to Prometheus that was a profound no-no. So what he did to Prometheus, that is to say what Zeus did to Prometheus, was to chain him to a rock, and every day a very large eagle-like bird came down and ate his liver out. And then it would grow back, and the same thing would happen the next day. So it sounds like a pretty nasty way to live. And Zeus was nothing if not creative in his many, many punishments. Secondly, Zeus decides, you know what, those humans are getting uppity, so we're going to have to punish them too. And he did so by ordering 3 of his compatriots, Hermes, Athena, and Hephaestus, to create woman. Now think about that. Zeus punishes mankind by creating woman. Interesting. So Pandora, whose name literally means all gifts, then becomes the catalyst of the decline of man, of man's downfall. And she does this by opening a box that Zeus had given her, in which were contained all of the evils of the world, things like disease and hardship, and pork rinds and, other bad things, basically suffering in a box. And that was unleashed upon the world as punishment of humans for displeasing Zeus. But, sort of as a last parting shot, Zeus also included in the box that Pandora opened and released this thing called hope, to save mankind from despair. It is inevitable that we will despair, but we have a palliative in the form of hope to keep us going, even as we suffer from that despair. And you will note that this is remarkably similar to the themes in Genesis, in the Old Testament of the Bible and the Torah. Speaking of which, hope is found liberally in all divine texts. I tend to focus on the Abrahamic faiths, of which there are 3, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. But you can look in any world religion and find allusions to hope. If we just restrict our attention to the Bible for the moment, out of convenience, because life is short and we have to get through this material, you will find dozens upon dozens of allusions to hope in both the Old and New Testaments. In fact, they're so numerous that it's helpful to classify these hope allusions according to category. For instance, we have a definition of hope as a confident expectations in Romans and in Hebrews. We have the notion that without hope, life is meaningless, presented in Lamentations and also in Job. We see Jesus as the fulfillment of the Old Testament promise and hope of eternal life in Matthew and Peter. Hope is represented for its endurance qualities through suffering in Romans. Faith, hope, and love are identified as the foundation of Christian life in Corinthians. The idea that love springs from hope is presented in Colossians. That hope produces joy and peace is in Romans, and there are many, many, many more of these. So just open the book, you'll find hope scattered throughout. But moving on to some of the less religious forms of cultural representation, let's take a look in the visual arts. And here's a painting by the sculptor George Frederick Watts, who occasionally did paintings, entitled Hope. And what you see here is a young woman dressed in rags. She appears to be perched on top of a globe. She's barefoot. She's leaning her head down to hear the sound that her harp makes, because the harp is down to one string, and one imagines that the song or the sound of the harp is rather dim. And it happened that one particular day, a person named Jeremiah Wright strolled through the London Art Gallery where this picture was hanging, and he was utterly taken by this picture. So what Jeremiah Wright said about this picture, and at this point I should let you know that Jeremiah Wright happens to be a clergyman. What he said about this when he saw it was, quote, "She sits there in rags. Her clothes are tattered as though she had been a victim of Hiroshima. Yet, the woman has the audacity to hope. She's playing that one string. She's playing her heart out, even though there's almost no sound. That is the definition of hope." Well, if you haven't picked up on this yet, the Reverend Jeremiah Wright was the pastor to a very particular man. His name is Barack Obama, And at one point, Wright gave a sermon in which he used the phrase, "the audacity of hope." Obama happened to be in the audience, so he appropriated that phrase, and he used it in his keynote address to the 2004 Democratic National Convention. Now, prior to that instance, he was a pretty unknown state senator in the state of Illinois. But because of his keynote address in 2004, he was overwhelmed with a positive response. He broke through to the national stage, and one could say that he took hope and that phrase all the way to the White House. So we might consider what that says about the power of hope. We have many representations of hope in architecture, but one of my favorites are the collection of buildings that we know collectively as 14th century cathedrals. They're European, and there's a bunch of them that were built during the 14th century, which also happened to coincide with one of the most devastating events in human history that has impacted mankind collectively, which we know as the bubonic plague, which swept across Europe in roughly 1346 to 1348, and in its wake it killed 50% of the European population in a ghastly, ugly, incomprehensible 3 years of extreme misery. Things were so bad that the death toll greatly exceeded the capacity of the culture to bury the dead, and so the dead lingered in the street, just making it possible for the disease to spread further and more quickly. Some forms of the disease were very highly virulent, so you could literally go to work in the morning, leave your family at home in the morning, and by dinner return and find them all dead. One chronicler, Agnolo di Turo, wrote of the experience that things were so bad, and I'm giving you a summary here, that his own prose is much more detailed and much more painful to read, but he said in conclusion that, and so many people thought that it was the end of the world. Such was the misery. And yet, at that same time, look what the survivors were doing. They were building some of the most beautiful and lasting monuments to the deity ever created. So even in the midst of this horrible plague that no one had any good explanation for, people were not giving up on God. Oh no, they were seeking ways to honor God even more during this time of great travail, and one imagines that it has something to do with the hope offered through religion, a theme which we'll also be exploring in this course. Hope is very well represented in poetry. We can choose poetry from many different millennia. I've chosen to go with a couple that are fairly recent, simply because the English is pretty understandable. So we'll start with Emily Dickinson, who represents hope as the thing with feathers, which is also a theme that recurs in this genre. So here's the first verse of her poem. Hope is the thing with feathers that perches in the soul and sings the tune without the words and never stops at all. And sweetest in the gale is heard, and sore must be the storm that could abash the little bird that kept so many warm. I've heard it in the chillest land and on the strangest sea, yet never in extremity it asked a crumb of me. So we learn from this stanza that hope not only is that thing with feathers that sings the tune without the words. You don't have to have words to understand it. It reaches into your soul and touches your soul, and that's how it communicates. We learn that where hope resides in this poem, it's very clearly in the soul. We learn that it's present everywhere when the gale is heard and in the storm. We learn that if you need hope, you can find it anywhere. It's in the chillest land, on the strangest sea. And best of all, you don't even have to do anything. It never asks you to do anything. It's simply there and present when you need it. So that's a very nice way to look at hope. So here's another representation of hope, this time by John Clare, who wonders if there's an afterlife, basically. And so he says, for instance, and why should instinct nourish hopes in vain? Why would we have this thing inside us that encourages us to think that there will be something more after we die? What is that hope all about? And he goes through a couple more lines, and then he comes to the point. He says, even the small violet feels a future power, which is manifest in the fact that every year the violet blooms again. So his point is that if so insignificant an organism as a violet can feel a potential future even after it passes, then surely mankind is no inferior flower who would be denied some sort of place to go after this life is done. So hope is that thing that allows us to think that it's not all over when this life is done. And so here's another way in which hope is related to religion, because, as you probably know, an afterlife is a key feature of most religions. Hope is extremely well represented in music. Again, if you're looking for iconic references to hope, music is a great place to go. In fact, in one of the exploratory exercises you will be doing, I think it's the third one, you're going to be looking at and listening to 3 musical offerings that come at hope from different perspectives, and you'll be asked to describe how that's accomplished. So suffice it to say for the moment that hope is often a theme that is used musically. All right. So we know that hope is clearly incorporated into and represented in a myriad of human activities. Again, this is throughout history in all cultures, even those which are experiencing incredible stress and ostensibly have no reason to live. Even those people nonetheless live in hope. So hope meets the definition of a genetic heritable trait. And while we did spend a bit of time looking at representations of hope that are not particularly scientific, we still need to keep the science in mind, because this, after all, is a science course. So, it is useful to ask how science is different from other modes of thought. And guess what? You'll be having an exploratory exercise on this thing too. In fact, it's the first one. So one of the things that you will learn is that in order to be scientific, an idea has to be hypothesis-based. It has to be evidence-based. The hypothesis has to be testable. You have to be able to run an experiment of some sort to collect data to help you decide whether the idea is true or not. Secondly, the hypothesis has to be falsifiable, which means if the idea is untrue, you have to be able to show that it's untrue. And we'll have a couple of videos available to you in the course of doing that exploratory exercise that will hopefully make this all quite vivid. So keeping that science in mind, if hope is truly an evolutionary idea, part of the scientific process, which is amenable to hypothesis testing, we should be able to make certain predictions. For instance, we should be able to find vestiges of hope in other animals, because we'd expect, if this were an evolutionary phenomenon, that it had roots in some primordial being that eventually gave rise to humans, but along the way it would have also been passed to other animals as a result of the evolutionary process. We should be able to find evidence of hope in ancient societies. If it's truly human, it should have roots in those ancient societies and be demonstrable in the artifacts that they've left or the texts that they've left. In modern children, we ought to be able to find evidence of hope without any sort of learning. It should be part of their basic behavioral repertoire that's in evidence in some way, as early as they can begin giving evidence for anything. And lastly, we ought to be able to identify the underlying physiology and perhaps psychology that creates this thing called hope. So those are some predictions that are scientific in nature, that are testable hypotheses and also falsifiable, that we ought to be able to take a look at in more detail later on to come to grips with the idea of whether or not hope is a scientific phenomenon. So those scientific ideas are the true substance of this course, and what we're going to do throughout the course is to use the human capacity for hope as well as the universal human desire to worship a supernatural deity as a way of understanding what it means to be human. And here's your study guide for today's module. Remember, I use the study guides to write the quizzes, so it behooves you, to even print these out for future study. All right, see you next module.